Chapter 4 The Investigators. The Rock of Judgement plowed past a shower of bright-tailed comets that were whizzing through the system on a course equally erratic to its own. The feeble electric light that broached the plastic glass of its many windows grew stronger as artificial morning commenced. Lights throughout the high hallways, courtrooms, kitchens, computer rooms, cells, and offices of the station brightened. Soft music tinkled from concealed speakers. A recorded voice announced softly,
"Wake up, everybody. It is time to begin work. Today is April the 22nd. There's plenty of work to do, so please, everybody, wake up."
Romana walked briskly along the deep, carpeted corridor of level 6. She tapped on the door of the doctor's suite. There was no reply. She might have known he wouldn't stay put for the night. He had probably been out causing all sorts of mischief. She pushed open the door and walked into the luxury apartment. As she'd expected, the silver sheets on the four-poster had not been disturbed. She was about to leave when a snore came from the other side of the room. It issued from a high-backed chair that had been moved to face the cabin's porthole. The doctor's coat was draped over its back. "Doctor!" she called. "Doctor!" He leapt, startled from the chair, put up his arms and took on a fighting stance, then relaxed as he recognized her.
"Oh, it's only you."
"What have you been doing all night?" He beckoned her forward and pointed to a table upon which a collection of large books with yellowing pages crammed with small print had been appended.
"Romana," he said gravely, "I know everything."
"I already knew that, Doctor."
"No, I don't mean everything. I mean everything."
He indicated the books again.
"These belong to the usual occupant of this room, some judge person, probably away hanging people somewhere."
Romana picked up a few of the books and inspected their spines. The law, the state, the people. Legal procedures in the ultimate court. She grimaced. Jokes cracked by Archon Talbor.
"I know where we are and what goes on here," the doctor said. "I've read most of that lot."
"It can't have been that interesting. You fell asleep."
"Well, I've had a long day. Romana, what does Uva Beta Uva mean to you?"
She thought back to her academy studies. "It's near the center of Earth's galaxy. The star's a toroidal ecliptic with 14 planets, colonized in Earth year 2230. The doctor looked somewhat taken aback.
Spot on, spot on."
He moved to the automatic food unit and took out a slice of toast. With his free hand, he put on his coat, hat, and scarf.
"Now, this place is not only a court, it's also where they mete out punishment to all of their worst criminals. Murderers, mostly. A lot of the people in custody here are very dangerous, and many of them would like a chance to get out or get rescued."
He looked out at the stars.
"A few million miles of vacuum makes a pretty good prison wall. Difficult to spoon your way out of that. The place opened for business over 40 years ago. What's more, the course is constantly shifting. Nobody outside can be quite sure exactly where it is."
They watched as a green planet of middling size passed by slowly. "A bit like us in the Black Guardian," Romana said, ruefully.
Now, 80% of those on murder charges are convicted, and 95% of that number end up in a particle reversal chamber. Gruesome, but what you'd expect from the human race, more or less. The few that escape that fate are transmatted back to 5 and prison."
He ate the last corner of his toast.
"By this time, they'll be feeling a bit jaded in these parts. Their mineral wealth dried up a long time ago."
Romana thought back to the events of the previous night. "I suppose it explains the drugs in the bar. The people who work here must require suppressants to keep them happy for such long spells of duty off-planet."
The doctor nodded. "Yes, although I doubt whether the station administrator and his chums partake of that stuff."
He wiped his fingers on a napkin.
"Let's go and find Spigot, shall we?"
Romana nodded. "And when his friends turn up? The people we're supposed to be?" The doctor grinned, pleased to be several steps ahead for once.
"Spigot is a trained investigator, a high-ranking officer, right?"
"Right."
"And he goes blundering into their computer control center, which he must know to be bristling with detection devices."
the doctor said.
Then greets two total strangers as trusted colleagues.
Perhaps he's just stupid, Romana pointed out. The doctor shook his head.
Perhaps he's just too clever by half.
In the duty room, Sham took a deep breath. He looked again at his wristwatch. There was no choice. Procedure was procedure. He had to refer staff problems to the administrator, whoever they involved. He called Pierpoint's office. "Sir, the chief hasn't reported for duty this morning." A brief silence.
"Strange. Have you tried her quarters?"
"There's no answer, sir," Sham said, almost apologetically. "She seems to have removed her communicator. Nobody on staff seen her since last night."
"Hold."
Pierpoint went offline. Sham wondered how the old man was going to handle the matter. Sham had noticed something odd about Margo in the last few months, but never thought she would disappear like this. Pierpoint came back online, his voice more confident.
"Sham,"
he ordered.
"I intend to take full responsibility for the Chief of Security. You are to take on her duties for the present. I want no mention of the matter in any official report, and there is to be no discussion of it within ranks or outside. You understand this?"
"Yes, sir."
"Furthermore, you are not to attempt to locate or contact the Chief. I have known her for many years, and I feel it will be better for me to deal with this privately."
"Yes, sir." Pierpoint paused, then added,
"I hope I have done well to place my trust in you, Sham. Trust is an invaluable commodity. 1 ounce is worth a ton of belzite."
Sham said nervously, "I understand, sir. Your confidence is appreciated." Pierpoint broke the link and sat back in his chair. The fingers of his left hand drummed anxiously on the deck. A bleeper sounded from inside the desk. Pierpoint pulled open a drawer and produced a small, rectangular device that had a speaker built into the side. He pressed a button, and a familiar voice came from the speaker.
"Ah, Mr. Spigot, it's a lovely morning."
Spigot's hand was being shaken vigorously. 3 seconds earlier, he had been asleep, lying with his face immersed in the folds of the bounciest pillow that the station's launderers could provide. It took another few moments to identify the grinning loon that had shaken him awake. Good morning, Doctor." He sat up and pulled the silver sheets close to his naked form as he saw that the girl had also entered the room. Not that he had anything to hide from a woman. "Hey," he croaked. "What time is this? I feel like a... He floundered for a simile as his hand stretched out, also searching. Romana threw him a pair of briefs from a pile of clothes stacked at the other side of the room. "Are you looking for these?" The doctor snatched them away. He shook his head at the blue-spotted pattern and handed them to Spigot.
"I thought you were supposed to be in plain clothes."
Spigot covered his embarrassment quickly and emerged from the bed. "You two are the craziest pair I've ever seen Central put together," he told them as he reached for more clothes. Romana spoke. "Perhaps we ought to explain. We're not from Cent," the doctor interrupted her, furiously gesturing for her to pipe down.
"Yes, well, what Romana means to say is that we didn't come directly from Central."
He leant conspiratorially close to Spigot and whispered,
"Do you know, they didn't even give us a proper briefing."
Spigot raised an eyebrow, held his gaze. "They didn't?"
"No. Very irregular, I thought. So perhaps you'd like to give us details of our mission."
Spigot pulled his black sweater over his head and crossed to the captain's food unit. He took out a plastic cup and filled it with coffee, sighed a few times, took a few sips of the scalding fluid, walked back and forth, and then turned to face them. "It started about 2 months back," he began. "Down on 5. One of the smart boys in the tech div labs picked something up." He grinned. "And that's pretty rare, I can tell you." He waited for the doctor and Romana to respond to his witticism, but they only stared at him as if he had released a bad smell into the air, and they were too polite to mention it. "They were running a comparative systems check on their security computers using the system here. Nothing more than that. Except that it registered minor faults in the data core that backs up the Rock security net."
"What sort of minor faults?"
the doctor asked. Spigot sipped his coffee again. "Big ones. About as big as a minor fault can get before it becomes a major fault. In a nutshell, the security system at this place is cracking up. So far the damage hasn't advanced, but it could get a lot worse." Romana settled herself on a couch. "Why didn't you just tell them and allow them to repair it?" Spigot pointed a long finger at her.
"There's the rub," he said. "I've got a contact down in the Big Smoke. Worked in computers years back. He pulled off a few frauds, but nothing too big. Deal is, I ignore him, he helps me when I need him." He finished the coffee and crushed the cup. "I guess we're both outsiders in a way."
"Get on with it," the doctor urged. "The computers."
Spigot decided to ignore the doctor's rudeness. He probably couldn't handle the idea of a loner getting results by twisting the rules.
"Yeah, well, my contact is sharper than anyone in Tech Div. He can hack his way into deep CompuSpace as easy as that."
To emphasize his point, Spigot attempted to click his fingers, but failed. Undaunted, he continued.
"He took a look at the printouts I smuggled out to him and said there was no way it was an internal fault. Someone was degrading the system. Someone clever. Someone more than clever."
He poured himself another coffee into another plastic cup.
"A genius."
"Did you check up on the people here?"
the doctor queried. Spigot nodded.
"Every last one. None of them have form, but you would expect that. Thing is, not one of the creeps has the nous to crash the system open. Whoever it is, we can't let them know we're onto them."
He took a huge gulp of the coffee.
"So, I decided to come up here to take a look about, on the quiet, but nothing seems to add up."
"No, it doesn't," the doctor agreed.
Suddenly, he stood up and made for the door.
"Well, come on, Romana."
The girl looked confused.
"Where exactly are we going?"
He stared at her as if she was a fool.
"To begin our investigations, of course. There's not a moment to lose."
Spigot stepped forward, worried. That wasn't the way he'd planned to use them.
"I wouldn't try computer control again, Doctor. Leave that side of things to me. I reckon you should just hang about, find out what you can."
The doctor fixed him with a manic stare.
"What? Fade into the background, keep a low profile, listen out for vital clues, that sort of thing?"
Spigot nodded.
"That'll do for the moment."
"Good, we do that sort of thing very well, don't we, Romana?"
"Yes, I do, Doctor," she said and led the way out.
Spigot watched them depart thankfully. Things were going well. That pair of Romany crazies were fitting into his plan like they'd been part of it from the start. It was time to get on with the job. He drained his coffee, crushed the plastic cup, checked his blaster, tucked it away in his jacket, and hurried out. Pierpoint switched off the listening device and replaced it in his desk drawer. He waited a moment, then snapped open a communicator channel.
"Computer control? This is High Archon Pierpoint. I want you to carry out a deep systems check on the data core of the security net. Yes, you heard correctly."
The doctor and Romana entered the lift. As soon as the shutter was closed, the doctor reached out and pressed a button at random.
"Spigot's playing some sort of game," Romana observed. "There must be a bugging device in that cabin. He wasn't talking to us, but to Pierpoint."
The doctor was lost in thought.
"Yes."
"But we're playing along with him?"
"For a while."
The doctor's huge blue eyes stared at the wall of the lift as if it were the most significant thing in the universe.
"We could always just go and have a look at the computer," Romana suggested.
The doctor licked his lips.
"The computer?"
he said gravely.
"Oh, I think there's considerably more at stake here than a machine on the blink."
"Is there?"
The doctor's mood switched suddenly.
"Yes!"
he cried, almost maniacally.
"Never overlook the elementary details, Romana."
She groaned.
"Which elementary details?"
"Never theorize ahead of the facts, either," he told her. "First rule of detection. Besides, you're a bright girl. I'm sure you can work it out for yourself."
The lift came to a halt, and the doctor breezed out. Romana directed her most venomous glare at his back and followed. Spigot pushed open the doors of computer control. Pierpoint stood in the center of the room, surrounded by a team of technicians. An animated display of the security net's data core, a twisting red cylinder, cartwheeled on the main screen. It looked to be in perfect health. Spigot nodded. A full inspection of each of the data core's 477 functions would busy the technicians for a tedious fortnight of processor checks and foreign program search and sweeps. His plan had worked out a treat. They were going to do this part of the job for him. Still, he had to make sure he didn't let on. He put on his best look of surprise and disappointment.
"What's going on here?"
he asked Pierpoint. Pierpoint turned to him and said,
A routine investigation. It is standard procedure for the security net to be subjected to random examination at the discretion of the station administrator.
Oh yeah? Spigot's eyes flicked over to the console where he had been apprehended last night. The keyboard was in pieces and a couple of technicians had their heads inside it. He tried to look more upset.
Is there any information you require from the net?
Pierpoint asked with a self-satisfied smile.
I'm sure one of our people can retrieve it for you. Now that you possess full clearance, you only have to ask.
Spigot glared at him.
That's all right, he said bitterly. Don't trouble yourself.
He turned his back on Pierpoint and left the control center. Great stuff. The observation dome was built into the roof of the station's highest level. An upturned bowl of clear plexiglass with a circumference of 100 meters, it overlooked the stars. Each worker was allowed 4 hours rest time in the observation dome per week, at periods allocated on the staff rota. Margo had visited the observation dome only when a routine patrol took her there. The spectacle it offered did not inspire her. She took her satisfaction in writing reports and giving orders, and if her eyes ever did turn to the stars, it was only to check that the asteroid's speed was as projected. The dome's supervisor was therefore understandably surprised when she walked in alone, wearing her plain white nightgown. He stopped himself from going to greet her. It was unwise to question the behavior of an officer of senior rank, however strange. He watched as she went calmly in her bare feet to the edge of the dome, put her hands to its side, and gazed out into space.
Yes, there is Corpalis, winking through the swirling dust of the vile nebula. The reference point at relative galactic coordinates 8549 southwest by 4691 north by northeast. Planet 2 is visible at a distance of about 65 million miles. It will be a simple task to confirm the station's relative position and speed and align the homing signal.
Margo shook her head and the inner voice faded. A jumbled group of algebraic figures were equating in long, disused sections of her mind. But she knew nothing of advanced mathematics and possessed only rudimentary skills in applied astrophysics. Her legs were quaking. She leaned her head against the glass and tried to steady herself. Trickles of sweat were collecting in her eyebrows. The tips of her fingers felt hot. Something made her raise her head. An impatience that seemed to come from inside, from the owner of the voice. It directed her eyes back to the star it called Corpalis.
Vectors at standard cruising speed,
it whispered through her lips.
Correlated to the adjacent angle of velocity and accountable factors of stellar drift.
The dome supervisor had left his desk.
Chief, is there anything I can do for you?
He asked nervously.
Chief?
She snapped her head up. Fool! She spat, a line of saliva dribbling over her chin.
They are...
She put a hand to her head and howled at the stars.
What's happening to me?
She wailed. She reached for her communicator. She had left it attached to her uniform back in her cabin.
Where?
The supervisor flicked on his own communicator.
Mr. Sham,
he called.
Please come to the observation dome. The chief is here. I think she's ill.
The door of the observation dome slid open, and the doctor and Romana walked in. They stopped as they caught sight of the situation. Sham looked nervously around computer control, but the technicians were too busy with their checks to have heard the call. Before he could reply, Pierpoint put up a hand. He broke into the call.
What's going on there?
He demanded, concerned.
It's the chief,
the dome supervisor started to say.
She's...
Margo's voice came from Pierpoint's communicator.
Pierpoint,
she said slowly.
Isolate her,
Pierpoint ordered. Sham noted the lines of concerns on his face.
Take her back to her cabin. I will join you there.
I am coming, Pierpoint.
Margo screamed. Her voice was suddenly powerful.
I am coming for you.
Pierpoint shook his head pityingly.
This situation is tragic. Tragic,
he told Sham. He spoke into his communicator.
Supervisor, restrain the chief.
Margo struggled from the grip of the supervisor.
No!
She cried.
Leave me alone! You are...
Her face contorted as she bit at her tongue as if trying to stop herself from speaking. The doctor took a step forward. He held her jaw in his hands and looked into her eyes. Something he saw there troubled him.
Night starvation. You need a good lie down and a dose of salts, he advised her.
She snarled. Her face was filled with hatred. She pushed the doctor aside and ran from the dome. The supervisor halted, only to register the bizarre attire of the doctor and Romana, and bolted after her. Romana, perturbed, pushed a stray lock of hair back under her cap. She looked almost rabid.
Yes, there's something very wrong there, the doctor said. The breakdowns happened incredibly quickly. Probably been building up for months.
Still, I suppose it's none of our concern. Romana looked through some papers on the vacated desk of the dome supervisor. She held up a sheet of paper triumphantly. Oh, look, a map. The doctor looked down at the stars. Romana examined the map, committing several important locations, including that of the TARDIS, to her memory. If the security office is cracking up, this station really is coming unstuck. Could there be a connection with Spigot's mission, do you think?
Well, everything's connected in some way, the doctor replied, nodding to the stars. It's the nature of the connection that's important.
Don't be so pompous. He turned abruptly.
Is that a map you've got there?
Yes.
Tell me what's on it.
He made for the exit. She followed. Courtrooms.
No, tried one, tried 'em all.
Dungeons?
Absolutely not. I can do that any day of the week.
How about the gallery?
Ah, now, that sounds more interesting.
I've lost her,
The voice of the dome supervisor reported over the communicator.
somewhere on level 10. She slipped away from me.
Pierpoint switched off the channel. He turned to Sham and whispered.
Sham, we will locate the chief ourselves. She may return to her cabin.
Sham nodded. Yes, sir. Spigot had returned to his luxury suite and was enjoying his midday meal, provided by the dispenser with its customary lack of culinary aplomb. He finished off the food and sighed. He longed for the simple, plain, traditional cooking of his own folk. Pies, mash, and plenty of gravy. Out here in space, the grub was flash, but tasteless. Still, he couldn't complain. Everything was going his way, every element falling into place perfectly. His methods had worked again. It looked like he was going to succeed once more. In a way, he thought, it was also inevitable. Yeah, cracking crimes was the easy part of his life. But what about Angie and the kids? He'd messed up there, and badly. He stood up. He'd given Pierpoint enough to worry about with the security check and the two crazies. The old gloat had fallen for it all. It was time to start the real work. Sham and Pierpoint found Margo as she emerged from a lift on level 5 of the station. Her hair was disheveled and her eyes stared straight ahead. Her lower lip trembled.
Margo, you need a rest,
Pierpoint said gently. He came towards her and placed one of his gnarled hands on her shoulder.
Let us help you.
Her face jerked into life as she caught sight of him.
Yes. Rest,
she said oddly, slurring her words.
I must rest. There is much to be done.
Sham leapt back as her back straightened and she knocked Pierpoint's hand away. She shouted,
I cannot rest. I must have control. The time is close, Pierpoint.
Pierpoint appeared perturbed by her words.
Sedate her,
he ordered. Sham unclipped a small stunner from his belt. He leapt forward and pressed it to Margo's neck. She lunged for him, growling ferociously. The sharpened tips of her fingernails scratched his cheek.
I will have control,
she snarled. Her legs buckled as the drug took effect.
The time is near.
Her eyes rolled under fluttering lids, and she collapsed. Sham rubbed his wounded cheek. The scratch had drawn blood. I've never seen the like of it, sir, he said. What happened to the chief? She's the last person I'd have thought. Pierpoint regained his composure.
This is not the time to speculate,
he said evenly.
Margo is very ill. I will take her back to her cabin myself.
His face was filled with what Sham took to be confusion and pity. Sham nodded uncertainly. He hadn't realized how much Margo meant to the old man. Pierpoint obviously cared enough to break the rules that he was employed to uphold in order to protect her. It was touching, in a way. Right away, sir. Shall I call a medic? Pierpoint shook his head impatiently.
I will handle this matter. Now, return to your duties and say nothing of this.
Splendid! Cried the artist as he stepped back from the completed canvas. He waved his paintbrush about in glee. One of my very best! I astound myself. The subject, the materials, He appeared to search his extensive vocabulary for the best way to describe the latest pinnacle of his invention. The piquancy! Yes, the piquancy of the whole!
Your brushwork is awfully broad,
said the doctor, who was looking over his shoulder.
Naturally,
the artist replied.
It's a very broad work, conceptually speaking.
He broke off and stared at the doctor.
And who in the halls of Hades might you be?
The doctor bowed.
Well, I'm the doctor, this is Romana, and we're travelers, and we thought we'd take a look at your gallery, and...
He trailed off as he realized that the artist was not listening. The fellow was frantically smoothing at his bald head with one hand, attending to hair that had disappeared long ago. The other hand was extended towards Romana. His large, rolling eyes were occupied in an active appraisal of her. The doctor huffed. Romana tended to bring this reaction out in people. It was most irritating.
Ramona,
the artist said slowly.
Romana,
she corrected him.
Romana!
His slippery tongue relished every syllable. He took her hand and planted a small kiss upon it.
An enchanting name for an enchanting young woman. Where did you come by it?
Prydon Academy, she told him. And I'm actually a lady. He took a step back and emitted a seedy chuckle from the deepest point of his larynx.
A lady! Oh, of course, yes, I should have realized. A regal vision! The noble brow, the milk-white skin, those pert lips.
The doctor coughed.
Excuse me.
The artist ignored him. He led Romana forward until she was standing directly within a pool of light that shone from one of the gallery's hanging lamps.
Yes, yes, he enthused. You, my dear, will make a scintillating subject.
He leaned closer and slipped a long arm around her shoulder.
Tell me, sweet child, have you ever posed for the life classes?
Romana was untroubled by his attentions.
Suppose I don't want to be your subject.
The artist waved a hand dismissively.
Oh, but my dear, you're so clearly suited to my methods.
The doctor tapped him on the shoulder.
Listen, do you mind, sir? I am conducting business.
He broke off and stared at the doctor, then at his clothes. His expression altered to one of cautious welcome.
Don't I know you?
The doctor thought for a moment.
I hope not.
You're nothing to do with the old scratcher,
Mr. Pierpoint?
The doctor guessed correctly.
No. I have it! You're from the Arts Commission, another of their wretched inspections. Oddstock, is it? No, he's dead, isn't he? Though how anybody could tell, I don't know. You're not that fool Mellinger, and you're certainly not Sibylla Strang, as she's a woman, just about so...
He clicked his fingers.
I've hit upon it! You're Fenton Breedley, aren't you?
The doctor attempted to say no, but the artist was in full flow.
Caught the teensiest glimpse of your exhibition in the regional back in 19. Rather unaccomplished. What are you doing here, then?
I'm the doctor, and I've never exhibited anything, the doctor gasped.
We're not inspectors, just visitors, said Romana.
The artist took a step back.
Visitors? To the gallery?
He took another look at them.
I say, you're not lawyers or anything?
The doctor wandered over to a grotesque sculpture that was mounted on a nearby plinth. Its fierce eyes seemed to stare back at him.
No, just visitors, Mr.
The artist bowed.
Stokes! Menlove Award Stokes!
The doctor nodded in acknowledgement.
Mr. Stokes, what is the point of this collection?
It does seem somewhat irregular having an art gallery at the bottom of a courtroom.
Stokes raised an affronted eyebrow.
Does it so? Yes, I suppose to the nescient mind that is how it might appear. The endeavor is entirely mine. I established myself here on this miserable blasted rock 7 years ago on the death of my father. He was a planetary counselor, you know. Oh, really?
The doctor mumbled, thoroughly unimpressed.
Yes, but the half-life of public service was not for me. His unfortunate demise provided me with the funds necessary to create this modest snugglery. I am official artist in residence.
Romana read from a plaque attached to a representation of a deformed creature that was covered in blood.
Vento, the three-headed killer of the lowest city. Nasty.
Are all your pictures of criminals?
The doctor asked.
Yes, Stokes replied. I have employed as my subjects many of the murderous souls who have met their deaths here over the last 7 years. Most are happy to trust themselves to me.
The doctor shook his head as he examined more of Stokes's work.
Why can't you paint nice things like sunflowers? Oh, Doctor, our society needs a fearless artist to delve into the criminal's psyche.
The doctor said doubtfully.
It'd help if you could do it better.
Stokes snapped upright.
What did you say?
He wagged an aggressive finger at the doctor.
I suppose those aging cretins at Gelheisen sent you to check up on me, did they? I'll show them. My genius is before its time. And when I return, I'll show them. I don't like people pointing an aggressive finger at me, the doctor told him. And I'm afraid I really have no idea what you're talking about.
Stokes jeered.
I've faced tougher men than you, Doctor. I have encountered villains worse than you could possibly imagine. Oh, really? Yes, the Zingtown Basher, Strapping Jack, all have passed through my studio. I dared to make a mask of Zeus herself, and so your ignorant ramblings are unlikely to impress me.
A promising argument was interrupted by a polite request from Romana.
Mr. Stokes,
he smiled.
Yes, my dear?
I was wondering what this piece signifies.
She pointed to a frame that contained a letter.
That is not my own creation, Stokes explained, but it remains a fascinating item of criminal memorabilia. It's a copy of a letter received by the police authorities shortly after the arrest of the Nisbet firm. Must be, 5, 6 years ago now? Although, of course, they never caught up with the Nisbet brothers themselves. They're still out there somewhere.
He shuddered. The doctor squinted up at the letter.
Dear boss, we've got it in for your sort after they nicked our lads. We are right down on coppers. We are respectable businessmen and we were provoked. You can't pin anything on us. We'll be back. Charles and Edward Nisbet. Appalling grammar and spelling, the doctor observed, and I don't think much of the tone. Not a sentiment to express in their company, Doctor, said Stokes. The kind of business they were involved in was anything but respectable. Extortion, fraud, smuggling, arms dealing, torture, multiple murder, and that was just for openers.
Romana picked up another exhibit, a purple print that had been leant against a wall.
Now, I prefer this.
The doctor joined her.
Yes, that's much better. Easy on the eye.
Stokes snatched the print away.
You can't be serious, surely.
I think it's your best work, Romana complimented him.
Perhaps because it's not his,
a voice said from behind them. A young man had entered the gallery. He was smiling broadly.
It's mine.
Stokes threw the picture at him.
And you can have it!
He gestured to the doctor and Romana.
Don't imagine that these people have any critical skills, Zai. I mean, just look at them.
Zai sneered at him.
You know, men, there are 2 things I have to tell you.
Stokes sneered back.
Oh, really? My ears wait.
First is, I've made another sale today, and upped the price. Second is...
He paused for effect, his clear blue eyes glistening with malice.
I'm putting in a bid to take this place over when your lease runs out. End of July, isn't it?
Stokes flushed as purple as Zai's picture.
You! An Irontown upstart barely out of the creche? I have to laugh. And how do you intend to raise the funds?
The government have agreed to grant me an award, Zai said smoothly. I spoke to the Arts Committee last night over VidiLink, and I can get the rest through my sales.
Stokes' arms flapped furiously.
Ludicrous! It is my duty to warn you, I suppose. Your talent stretches no further than your own deluded imagination.
The doctor nudged Romana, and they slipped out of the gallery, leaving the artists to their argument. The raised voices echoed out of the gallery and along the corridor, leaving to the lift.
Oh yes,
Zai was saying.
And when was your last sale? What do you really think you're doing here with all this junk? It's so much garbage.
Stokes screamed.
Cretin! Out! Out! Out!
The shelves of the station's library creaked with books. Thick volumes crammed with judgments, rulings, transcripts, and statutes. Staircases curled from shadowy corners, tempting the borrower up or down to specialized sections on agricultural policy, reports on remand reform, successfully contested libel actions. Pale librarians shuffled along the aisles, arranging and rearranging the texts. Barristers and their clerks spoke in loud, bluff voices and stood importantly on stepladders, reaching for obscure sources as if they were pioneers planting flags on towering summits. Spigot made his way to the far end of the library and a section of shelving devoted to what were known as dead files. It was here that papers pertaining to matters dealt with by the courts of the Rock found their final resting place. Finished cases that waited 5 years for public interest to fade before being fed to the shredder. Spigot coughed at the dust released as he tugged one of the crumbling cardboard files from its position. He couldn't believe that this stuff hadn't been transferred to computer. The legal profession's centuries-old distrust of technology was scarcely credible. Another area of weakness. He peered at the fading writing on the edges of each bulging file. The cases were ordered by a complicated numbering system that made no sense. He gritted his teeth. He wasn't used to grubbing about with damp old files. There were rows and rows of the things. It might take him hours to find what he was looking for. And all the while, valuable time was passing. Pierpoint led the dazed Margo into her cabin and settled her onto her bed. Her head turned from side to side on her starched pillow.
Hi,
she started to say.
Shh, no,
Pierpoint told her. His attention was taken by the open pad on her desk drawer. He picked it up and stared at the rows of equations.
Margo, he told her, you must stay here and relax.
He sat on the bed and took one of her hands.
Do you understand me? You must stay here. Relax. Don't trouble yourself. Everything will come right soon. I will protect you, old friend.
He gave the hand a slight squeeze of reassurance. She smiled up at him and nodded.
Yes, relax,
she whispered.
I must relax.
Her eyes closed and her head fell back on the pillow. Pierpoint waited a moment. He carefully removed his hand from hers and stood up. He looked down at the mathematical symbols on the page in his hand and frowned.
What is she doing? I've done all I can for her. What is this?
He replaced the sheet of paper and left the cabin, locking the door behind him. Margo's eyes opened. Pierpoint took a lift up to the courtrooms. He walked with a heavy step along the crowded corridors, his grim presence enough to startle into silence an excited huddle of lawyers noisily engaged in arguing a technical point at the end of the working week. He was about to return to his office when a call came through from Sham.
Sir, Spigot has gone to the library. Do you want us to find out what he's up to?
Pierpoint thought.
No, Sham,
he said.
I understand the way his mind works. He is attempting to confuse and divert us. Leave him to it.
The doctor and Romana watched Pierpoint from a nearby alcove. He straightened his tunic and entered the suite that contained his office. The doctor was puzzled.
What's old Spigot doing in the library then?
He wondered aloud.
Unless... Ah! He held up a finger. Yes, of course.
He's probably gone there to check files about whatever it is he's not telling us, Romana said casually.
Why do you always have to spoil it for me? Asked the doctor. You're not supposed to have worked that out yet.
He chewed his bottom lip.
There is something you can do for me, though.
What? Check up on Spigot?
No. Just stay here and keep an eye on things. I won't be long.
He fumbled in his pockets, produced a small tin whistle, and blew into it.
We need K9. I thought I'd meet him on the way.
He started to walk away. Romana grabbed his arm.
Doctor, why do we need K9?
He grinned back at her.
Because K9 can carry out instant checks on the computers.
You said the computer wasn't important.
The doctor nodded.
Yes, I did. But perhaps its apparent lack of importance is in itself important, eh?
He tried to leave again. Again, Romana stopped him.
Doctor?
Yes, what now?
You're very irritating.
He smiled.
I suppose I am, but it's ages since I got the chance to do some good old-fashioned criminal investigation.
His tone suddenly became very serious.
There's a crime behind a crime here, Romana, and Spigot isn't telling us, or Pierpoint, or anybody else half of what he knows.
He strode off down the corridor. Stokes was alone in the gallery. He had gathered Zai's materials and cases and tipped them into a heap. He wiped a trail of dribble that slid from his mouth at the prospect of losing the project he had originated to that young fool.
He wouldn't dare! The Arts Committee will laugh him out of their office after one glance at his derivative doodlings. The scheming little devil! I'll...
A click came from the darkness that shrouded the huge door of the gallery. Stokes called out.
Who's that? Who is there?
He walked forward. There was no response.
I said, who is there? Zai?
The miserable runt was afraid to show himself.
Don't hide in the shadows, boy. I know you're there.
What are you, blackness? The butt of a standard-issue blaster came down across the back of Stokes's head. All 16 flabby stone of him slid heavily to the marble floor in much the same fashion as a badly designed building slips off a cliff edge. Margo returned the blaster to its place on her belt. She looked around at the gallery and laughed. What nonsense. It had been easy to escape from the cabin. That idiot Pierpoint had thought to imprison her behind a simple door lock. She had put on her uniform, crept to the emergency stairs, and made her way down to the gallery unobserved. She picked up the sculpture of Ventol, the three-headed killer of the lower city, and threw it across the room. It smashed into serrated chunks and threw out a cloud of dust.
I have returned,
she said exultantly.
The time has come at last. The process has worked. I have full control.
She reached for another of the exhibits. The ultrasonic signal of the doctor's whistle penetrated the trans-dimensional envelope of the TARDIS and made itself known to the small section of awareness K9 had left online as he recharged his energy banks. The head of the robot dog tilted upward, and his eye screen glowed a healthy red.
Coming, Master,
he said.
This unit is fully recharged and functioning at 96.87% of full capacity.
He sent a signal to the console that tripped the door control and whirred through. The woman that had been Margo surveyed the ruins of the gallery and nodded approvingly. A beastly hiss issued from her lips. It would be good to kill, she thought. Just one normal, now, as an appetizer. She would relish the taste of death. The hefty weight of Stokes lay temptingly sprawled before her. But she dismissed him. She wanted to look into the eyes of her victim, to witness the terror that her gaze could bring. She had to kill. She left the gallery and returned to the stairway. A normal was sure to pass by eventually. Romana sat on one of the leather-buttoned couches that lined the corridors outside the courtrooms. The large and loud clock above the main courtroom had just struck 6. Most of the lawyers and staff had returned to their quarters. She was reviewing the events of the last few hours in an attempt to follow the doctor's reasoning. She was by now more than accustomed to his arbitrary behavior and leaps of logic, but her examination of the facts could not clarify why he should have become so concerned over a sabotaged computer and a lying policeman. She suspected he was looking for complications that weren't there. She was also becoming bored. Her boredom disappeared in an instant as she saw Zai walking along the corridor. His eyes were fixed ahead, and he walked past without noticing her. Curious, she climbed from the couch and followed him from the court area, taking care to keep her distance. He led her to a huge metal door at the far end of the corridor. He stopped and glanced about nervously. She hid behind a pillar and watched as he slid the metal door open and walked through. Romana waited 30 seconds and pursued him. She knew from the map she'd memorized earlier that the door led to the emergency stairway, a network of steps that hugged the side of the station's buildings and led not only to the other floors, but also to the Rock's emergency escape capsules. Beyond was a narrow staircase that tapered spirally downwards into darkness. Old electric lamps shone up through the latticed metalwork of the steps. A checkered pattern of shadow fell over Romana's face. The clatter of Zai's hurrying footsteps echoed up the shaft of the stairwell. Careful not to alert him to her presence, she slipped off her boots and tiptoed after him. Spigot checked another file. His eyes widened as he saw the name of the case. At last! He tugged it from the shelving and took it to the nearest desk for closer examination. It had been stuffed with bundles of reports and notes and tied with rotting green string. He unpicked the knot and delved inside. It contained a lengthy summary of the case and relevant points of law, copies of the sentencing certificate, and a set of photographs sandwiched between squares of brown card secured in a plastic binder. Spigot flipped the binder open. It was much as the system had been told by the eager media 3 years before. The victims had been squashed flat, compressed into bundles of blood-drenched skin and bone. Spigot had seen death in many forms. It was part of the job, and he was accustomed to it, but he'd never seen it like this. He swallowed to calm his stomach, and recalling his rookie training, thought of ordinary, better things. His goldfish, his house, Angie and the kids. He found the death certificate pressed beneath the book of photographs. It stated clearly that Zeus, self-proclaimed princess of the Gwal territories, last of the ugly mutants, genius, terrorist, and killer of at least 2,000 humans, had been terminated by particle reversal almost 3 years ago. The certificate had been signed by Margo and was countersigned by Pierpoint. He closed the file and tapped a finger against his teeth. Then who, he wondered, killed the miners on Planet 11? Zai had led Romana on an exhausting climb down 8 flights of stairs and had now reached the junction of the stairway with the basement. Romana watched from what she considered to be a safe distance.
That old coot,
she heard Zai mumble as he turned for the exit that would take him back to the gallery.
He's finally going to get what's been coming to him.
A step creaked under Romana's foot, and Zai's head turned. She knew there was nowhere to hide, so she stepped from cover.
Hello,
she said, returning her boots to her feet. He jumped.
What are you doing here?
I've just been having a look around, she said. I'm free to. This is a public area, isn't it? Zai stared up at her, trying to judge the situation. She could see that he was considering what action to take.
What are you, an investigator, or one of Stokes' mates?
Neither, she replied. Zai sprinted for the staircase. He pushed past her and clattered up the steps. Romana pulled herself up and hurried after him. He couldn't be more than 10 seconds in front of her. She followed him around the corkscrew staircase without pausing to take a breath. Wait! I only want to talk to you. The rattle of Zai's footsteps stopped abruptly. She imagined that he must have passed through a doorway and returned to the main building. She vaulted the next steps 3 at a time, wishing for once that her legs could be as long as the doctor's, but there was no sign of a doorway. She stopped and looked about confused. Her lungs panted like bellows as she drew short breaths. Zai had disappeared, perhaps into a secret passage or something? It would be only natural for a building like this to contain several. Another sound came from the steps above her, a gentle percussion on the edge of her hearing, a dripping noise. The lights went out, above and below. Romana gathered her wits and turned the corner. "Zai?" she called. No response. The dripping continued. She climbed another few steps slowly. The toe of her boot nudged something sticky. She knelt down and dabbed at the glutinous patch with a finger. She let out a cry. Human blood. Somebody started to walk down the steps in front of her. In panic, she tried to retrace her route, but lost her footing. She tumbled down the staircase. Her head banged painfully against a strut on the landing below, and she lost consciousness. The lights flickered back on. Standing over the body of Romana was Margo. She stood proud and upright, her hands on her hips. The boots of her uniform were caked with blood. Clamped over her face was the shining silver mask of Zeus, her eyes glinting cruelly through its slanted slits.